Hello friends, for today's video we're looking at the top 50 fantasy books of the last 5 years. Specifically for today, we are zeroing in on the year 2022. If you missed parts 1 and 2 of this video series, the idea is that per video we are zeroing in on a specific year. So as you would expect, for the first video it was 2020, then 2021, and as noted today we're looking at 2022. And to be clear, these are the books that the community deemed the best of the genre of those given years. This is not by any means my top 50 fantasy books of the last 5 years. This would probably be a very different looking list if it was. But with each new installment, you will get to have a peek at what was already ranked in the previous videos. So you will see the books from 2020 and 2021 today, and I'm adding to it. By the time we get through part 5, you'll get to see the full 50 books. The reason I wanted to break it up is twofold. First off, I do want to actually have the time to elaborate just a little bit on the books, and I feel like by breaking it apart, we can actually kind of take more of a snapshot view of what that year looked like, what was popular that year, what was on trend, what didn't work, what did work. I noted that for 2021, I feel like that was maybe the weakest year, and that makes sense given what was transpiring in 2020. So it's just kind of interesting to take a look at these individual years, and then also by the end we can zoom out and see what the trends were, how they shifted, and then that'll lead us into the Goodreads Choice Award nominees of this year, and we can kind of examine how things were, how they are currently, and then where we think they're going to go. The additional reason, though, I wanted to break it up by year is that I think most of you are aware, especially if you've watched parts 1 and 2, but this would be 5 years since I lost my father. I was really close with my dad, and I'd been making videos around books before he passed away, and then I've been making videos obviously since he passed away. And I do feel like I try as much as possible to always focus on books, because I know that's what people come to this channel for, or just talk about things that are related to books and things that have to do with trends and with where the genre is. But I do feel like social media has a tendency for people, even when they're really well-intentioned, I think people are trying to put their best foot forward, and it can make you feel very isolated in whatever thing you're experiencing, whatever thing you're going through, because sometimes you know that the person on social media is going through something similar, but it just feels like, oh, they're just handling it better than I am. So the idea is that I wanted to also give you a little view of what I was going through in those given years, and also mention a charity to kind of add to something that's a little bit nicer through all of this, so it's not just talking about sad stuff, but mention a charity that I feel like in some way represents the kind of person my dad was. So it's a look back at fantasy, it's a look back at all of the things that made the genre what it was in those years, but then also it's kind of a little nod to my dad. So I'm going to start with that. If that's not what you're interested in, or maybe you're in a position right now where you yourself are going through the grieving process and it's just too difficult to hear or to watch, then I'll have a timestamp and you can skip straight ahead to the book stuff. But the thing that I wanted to note within this given year, there's actually 2 things about this. The first year, of course, was just the loss of my dad and trying to get back up on my feet. And then the second year, for 2021, I mentioned that it was a lot of trying to get back to normal, but then there's all the things that come after. So you don't really get the time to just focus on yourself, because for me, I was the executor of the will, which meant I was the one responsible for probate. I also was the one that anytime there was anything to do with what typically comes with after a person dies, I was always the one that had to answer the call. I was always the one having to let everybody know everything. And that's tough because you're trying to process somebody being gone that you love so much and that was such a significant part of your life, but then you're also trying to basically do paperwork. So that's what the first 2 years were like. Then 2022 was literally when it rains, it pours, because this is the beginning of all of the troubles in my house. So I know this seems like a weird thing to zero in on in relation to grief, but when you are struggling and you're trying to get through something, when you have these kinds of other things go wrong, you really just feel like throwing a tantrum and being like, why can't anything work out? Why can't anything be better? And then, of course, you pause and you think like, so many other people are going through way worse than me, and here I am sad because I have a leak, in my roof, or whatever the case may be. We had a little bit more than a leak, which I'll touch on, but there is just this feeling of like, oh, it's never ending. The second I think I'm starting to feel a little better, I'm starting to get through all this tedious stuff that goes alongside the heavy stuff, and then life kind of reminds you, you know that other stuff sucks too, right? So there was that. And then also this year was when my grandmother's health started to really not be well. She had dementia, and it was starting to get really bad that year, which was obviously really difficult for me, but especially for my mom. And my mom, most of my life, she was the one of her siblings who was there for my grandma the most in all sorts of ways. My grandma is from Cuba, so I feel like my mom was very much helping her with just everyday life in America, for one. She often took care of her. My grandma had a lot of trials in her life too, and my mom was always there for her. So when my grandma was experiencing memory loss, this was really challenging for my mom, and it was challenging for me, but then also it was like, I wanted to be there for my mom, and then also I'm still trying to, I think about a couple years in, you almost trick yourself into thinking like you're all better now, and you're not really when you're still grieving somebody who you cared so deeply for. But this year was one of those, I think it was like a reminder year that life is still really challenging, even when you're going through everything else that's challenging in relation to grief. So my grandma, this is when her health was not doing great. Her family, meaning my mom's siblings, they were all trying to help my grandma as much as they could, and unfortunately, they didn't have the means to kind of drop everything and then try to take care of her full time, especially if you have had a family member with dementia and you're a working adult, you work full time. You know, it is a full-time job to take care of somebody who isn't always able to have a firm grasp on reality. So it was its own trials. And then the house stuff. So there are so many things that have transpired in our house over the last 5 years. So to give some context, my parents split up when I was 10, and my dad moved into eventually this house, which is a mobile home. And he was a very handy guy. He added 2 rooms onto the back, which are behind this room. He added 2 rooms onto the back. He built a back porch. I mean, he was an exceptional person. And he did all of that to try to fix up his house. And he was really handy, and he did all sorts of things to make this the best home it could be. But it was definitely a fixer-upper of homes, and it had a lot of issues. And because the previous years went during the grieving process, I should say, because the previous years were trying to take care of everything that you are expected to take care of after somebody passes away, the home was not necessarily at the forefront of my mind. I wanted to eventually get around to fixing it up, but there's also it reminding you, hey, I'm old and I'm going to start falling apart whether you are paying attention to me or not. So as an example, there's a part of the roof where there's this stuff that goes over it that helps with whenever it rains. It kind of has the water go off of it. And if you don't know, Arizona is known to have some pretty intense monsoon storms, and we get really intense winds as well. Most of you have probably seen the dust storms that come through on the news and other such things, but we get rain on occasion as well. And there was a storm, it was a really bad lightning thunderstorm. It took the nails out of this, the thing, because obviously this was nailed down. It took the nails out and the whole thing rolled over. So then the actual roof and the materials that you don't want getting wet were just exposed. And my husband was like, I gotta go get a ladder and try to put it back. And I'm like, not during this thunderstorm. You are not doing that. I'm not having you get electrocuted and, struck by lightning or something. While it's just fine. We'll deal with the water damage. But it came through we have bubbles now from the paint on our ceiling in the back 2 rooms that eventually that'll get fixed. That's still not fixed. But there's the bubbles because so much water came through. Also, it came in through where the ceiling fan was, and it just poured onto our bed because our bed is under the ceiling fan. So that was completely soaked through. It was leaking in the front of the house, which it's not even where the add-ons are. It's just the front of the house. There was leaks there. And then we got a lot of mold in our bathroom, and then we had to have the whole ceiling of the bathroom taken out, and that lasted months. We didn't have a ceiling in our bathroom for months. The roof itself we did have to get fixed, but believe it or not, even though the insurance money, we got some money from insurance, we haven't actually still gotten the money. They issued us money, but then they issued it to my dad, and I had to be like, hey, my dad's dead. I'm not my dad, but I do live in this house, and I am the person. I had to explain all of this. They finally got it changed, and then at that point, the check for the insurance it had been too long. So it's like, oh, well, we need you to send the check again for all this damage. We had to get the roof fixed in the meantime, which put us a lot of money in the hole. And then they then were like, well, we'll have to send somebody out to assess the damage. And I was like, somebody already did that. That's how you came up with the amount. And then they're like, oh, sorry, we were confused. Always something, always something. So we still haven't gotten our insurance money. And the bathroom was a big issue. The roof was a big issue. There was all sorts of other things happening. So that was fun. But that was what that year was like. It was a lot of, sorry, Luna's grumbling if you hear her. It was a lot of, I think I'm doing better. I think I'm starting to finally feel better. Am I feeling better? I think so. Oh no, why is everything always going wrong? It was a lot of that. It was kind of the extremes. And then, as noted, I'll come to talk about books and be like, let me tell you about this book I read. And on that note, let's talk about the books that came out this year. Just to note, some of these books I didn't read the year that they came out, although a fair amount of these I actually did read the year they came out. And a nice thing about 2022 is that I didn't despise anything that came out. I didn't really despise any of these books from these last 5 years. I wasn't passionately upset about any of them, really. There were some that I liked more than others, and I would say most of the ones I didn't absolutely love were in the year 2021. But 2022 was pretty good. There were no really big standouts. Almost everything is in the top 3 tiers. So let's just actually go ahead and start with the one book that's in the 4th tier. If you need a little bit of a reminder of what these tiers represent, the 4th tier is, this didn't quite work for me, but if it's the first in a series, I might still pick up the rest of the series. I might give the other books a try, because maybe it's just, I gotta get my footing. The first book is really introductory, and then it'll expand or it'll deepen within the sequels. And I'd say that's relatively true for the first one that we're going to be talking about, which would be the Atlas 6. I actually think other people might rank this one lower, because it had quite the pendulum swing. There were people that were shouting from the rooftops about how great it was. And then from there, other people were like, this sucks. And then it felt like it was hard to find people that just felt middle of the road on the Atlas 6. But I was one of those people. I didn't really agree with the idea that it's one of the best things I've ever seen. But I also didn't agree with the idea that it was one of the worst things I'd ever seen. I just kind of felt fine on it. I do want to eventually go back and probably reread it and then finish the series. Although it doesn't seem like people loved the sequels. But I haven't seen too much of the details surrounding that, because I've kind of avoided seeing what people's thoughts are as to why they don't like the sequels as much. And maybe it's just a couple people I've seen, and maybe actually a lot of people really like the sequels. But the Atlas 6 is the lowest rated one for today, so that's a bonus. Now, the next group of books, I do like giving a poll to all of you with 4 of the books from these given years. And 4 because I would love to do more books, but YouTube only allows you to do 4 in its polls. And the one that was the winner of the poll for 2022 was Babel, which I did actually place in this 3rd tier. The other ones in the poll were A River Enchanted, Nettle and Bone, and Legends and Lattes. And the results, in case you are driving or you're not looking at the screen, Babel was at 34%, A River Enchanted was at 11%, and then Nettle and Bone and Legends and Lattes tied at 28%, which actually quite surprised me. I wasn't surprised that Babel won, because I think Babel is the most popular, and also I think Babel is tackling the heaviest of themes, which tend to result in people having the strongest impact as a result. The books stay with them, they make them think, they are great catalysts for conversation. So it didn't surprise me that Babel won. I was more surprised at the rest of them, because A River Enchanted, I actually think is quite good, and it's really, really well written, but I do think I'm biased because recently I read its sequel, and now as a whole, that duology sits quite high in my view. I liked it and I enjoyed it overall a lot. So I think that elevates the first book. I'm trying not to let my thoughts on the second one do that, but I do think maybe more people should try A River Enchanted and A Fire Endless, because they're quite good. And then Nettle and Bone and Legends and Lattes. I was surprised these tied, because in my mind, Legends and Lattes, maybe I think it's more popular, and loved, especially because while cozy fantasy, I think, was entering into the scene in a really meaningful way with House in the Cerulean Sea when that one came out, I do feel like there are different, obviously, types of cozy fantasy. So while cozy fantasy is a subgenre, I think even within it, it has almost its kinds of subgenres. And I do find that Legends and Lattes is a different kind of cozy fantasy from House in the Cerulean Sea. And it's one that I think feels a little less fiction-oriented, because there are some fantasy books that if they sold them in general fiction, it doesn't feel that surprising. I actually feel like Babel is one of those where if it was sold in fiction, I wouldn't probably bat an eye too much. I sometimes feel like when fantasy books get popular, they get placed in fiction, and that irritates me, so I'm not talking about that. I just mean there are certain books where I do feel like they don't necessarily use fantasy so significantly that it does kind of make sense to see them in fiction. Point is, I definitely feel like House in the Cerulean Sea, I could see being sold in fiction, but Legends and Lattes feels like cozy fantasy for people that are really into D&D or people who are really into RPGs, or that feeling that a lot of us, if we grew up playing video games that were fantasy leaning, that one kind of feels more like that. Whereas something like Nettle and Bone feels more fairy tale-esque, and it does feel original, and it does a lot of things that I really enjoyed, which is why I like it so much. But I think I was just surprised at just how much these were neck and neck, that they were tied. Luna, she grumbled again if you heard her. So, continuing on now past the poll, as noted, I had Babel in the third tier, because all the things I said about why I completely understand why it won the poll, I feel all those things, but also I don't think it impacted me as much as some other people. I find that something that's fairly consistent for me with R.F. Kuang's books is that I always appreciate what she's going for. I always really appreciate a lot of the themes that she's weaving into her stories. I just haven't yet felt like we dive as deep as I would like. And I think an example to counter off of this is something like Blood Over Bright Haven. I really feel like, and this is not, unfortunately, on this tier ranking, but Blood Over Bright Haven, I feel like is actually hitting a lot of similar themes to Babel. But with Blood Over Bright Haven, I really felt gutted by that one, and I feel like the author did such a good job of not just containing those themes, but showcasing those themes and the negative impacts of a lot of what you see transpiring in the story. And again, Babel does have those things. I just wish that we had a little bit more within them. So that's why it's here. We also have The Stardust Thief. This one I absolutely need to reread, and then I need to pick up its sequel, because its sequel was pushed back so many times. It finally came out, but I feel like it would be a disservice to pick up the second one when it's been so long since I read the first. The Stardust Thief was quite fun. It felt in some ways like this return to kind of this ragtag group of people that come together and they go on this adventure, except for the thing that I felt made it stand out is that you get within it pieces of the 1001 Nights within, and it's how it has its relation to what's transpiring in the story. You're like, oh, this is fun. It feels like they're experiencing versions of this tale or these various different tales while also having their own adventure. And I thought that was really cool. And I was finding myself always wanting to turn the page. I enjoyed it. I just don't know that when I was talking about Babel, I feel like really going for it with some of its themes. I don't know if I felt like that necessarily with this one. So maybe it's not going to have the emotional gut punches, but I still had a lot of fun with this one. We also have The Lost Metal. When I read The Lost Metal, I really enjoyed my reading of it, and it did rank for me a little bit on the higher end for most of the book in relation to the rest of the books in Mistborn Era 2. But the longer I'm away from it, the more irritating I found aspects of the ending. I will say also, I feel like The Lost Metal is all entirely basically a Sanderlanche, and I was satisfied with that as a series conclusion. I thought it was fun, but I think there are certain aspects to the rest of Mistborn Era 2 that make it somewhat stand out from other books in the genre in the fact that its setting is different, the fact that it is a continuation series, which I can be kind of picky about, but I feel like how Sanderson did the continuation was really fun. Luna Bear has come on over, so if you hear her little face is right here. There's her nose. But I'm trying not to go into spoilers, but there's a part at the end where a character just, they kind of ruin a scene that could have been well done, and Or at the very least, it could have been kind of emotional, and it wasn't, because I was like, really? Why? And I think the longer I am away from it, the more that sticks out in my head, and not the other parts of the book. After that, we have Daughter of the Moon Goddess, and I definitely think that the plot within this one, it's sequel as well, but we're talking about Daughter of the Moon Goddess specifically. I do feel like the plots don't necessarily feel like they're reinventing the wheel, but it's more about this almost familiar and nostalgic feeling plot within this really, really beautiful world. Because I do feel that the author describes the settings in a way that is very lush and vivid and vibrant, and it just feels, for lack of a better word, twinkly. And they are talking about these celestial beings within this celestial kingdom, and I think that's a perfect way to describe what the author captures within how they describe things. It really is pretty. And then after that, we have Electra. This is another retelling, and this is something we've come away from, which is fun in looking at the past 5 years, because a lot of us for a while are like, I'm kind of getting a little fatigued of the Greek retellings, Norse a little bit as well. And I think that we're kind of coming at the end of it, because Electra, while it was there in the Goodreads nominations, I think that we're seeing less and less of them now. But Electra, I really liked the way that we took this story and we focused on characters from this tale that don't necessarily get to have the spotlight, and the way that you see, specifically there's a mother character and her daughter, and the way that their environments have shaped them, how loss has shaped them, and also how they can live within the same house. They can have a lot of experiences that are shared, but those can resonate in different ways or can shape them in different ways, and in fact, it can even put them in opposition to each other. And it's one of those books where I almost would be curious to reread it now, because I think there are pieces of that concept that the older you get, I think especially if you have cousins or siblings or friends that you knew when you were younger, and then you stray and you become really different people, and you kind of think like, how did we stray so far apart, and how do we have such different views? And kind of reflecting on, how is this one thing that happened, how did it affect me so differently than it affected this other person? I think the older you get, the more that happens. So I almost feel like Electra might hit harder if I were to reread it again. But once again, everything in this tier they're all things that I enjoy. They're all things that, the way I've put it before is, if I had a physical copy, I'm going to keep that copy and I'm going to want it in my home library. So even though they're on the lower end for today's books, they're by no means lower. And also the tiers are not associated with stars. It's not like the third tier is a 3-star or anything like that. So these are all books that I quite enjoyed. Bouncing up now to tier 2. I actually have A River Enchanted in this tier. I've read A River Enchanted this year, and the writing is exquisite. I think Rebecca Ross, for me, is an example of somebody who writes lyrical, and maybe, I almost feel like it's lyrical, but doesn't lean into purple, because all of it is understandable, all of it is practical, and all of it evokes exactly what I feel like it's meant to, without ever saying things that are nonsensical. Because I think there are some writers who will write, I think Stephanie Garber, sometimes people will point to Stephanie Garber's books as doing this. She'll write in a way where you're like, what does that even mean? And you kind of have to read between the lines, and I don't mind that style of writing from time to time. I think it can be really fun, actually, because it feels just so creative and bizarre. But I don't think that's what Rebecca Ross does. I think Rebecca Ross just knows how to capture the mood, the feeling, the environment, and in ways that are beautiful. The way that she utilizes language to accomplish what she's trying to convey, I think, is exceptional. And also, I enjoyed the plot and I enjoyed the characters. So, I don't know, the more I think about it, I'm like, is this top tier? But again, I think that because I really liked Fire Endless, I think if I'm just looking at the first book is in this tier. I also put Legends and Lattes in this tier because I was very skeptical when Legends and Lattes came out. It's not that I thought it was going to be gimmicky by any means, but I just was like, I don't know. I mean, how cozy can it possibly feel? Everybody talks about how, because of course the character is opening this little bakery, essentially, like this coffee shop. It's a coffee shop, it's not a bakery, but they do sell baked goods eventually in the shop. But anyway, everybody would talk about like, oh, it just makes me feel like I'm sitting in a coffee shop and I can just smell all the wonderful smells and it's just comforting. And a little bit I'm like, I mean, I can feel those things going to a coffee shop, which is silly, but I just thought, I mean, how much is this whole high fantasy, low stakes really gonna work for me? And then I read it and I was like, it works. It does work. It was one of my first entries into what I described before, that kind of very fantasy heavy, fantasy forward, you could say, cozy fantasy books. And I was like, I get it now, and I am on board, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really fun, and I actually did really buy into the stakes, and I think Travis Baldree did a great job of showing how much you do not need it to be world-ending in order to make readers care. And then we also have KKE. This was when I feel like the word of the day for a lot of these is, how much did it impact me? And KKE I thought was very impactful. It is a retelling of a story that I am less familiar with than some of the other ones, like Electra, and I feel like what it did was so exceptional because it not only really embraced its setting, and also a lot of aspects to what you would see with the culture of these characters that we don't typically see in a lot of our fantasy. It really embraced those things, and simultaneously would have the character appreciate those things and be critical of those things. So it's asking, what do you do when you genuinely find that tradition can be valuable, but sometimes tradition is what's holding back progress? So how do you respect and honor tradition and want for things to move forward? And that's a really key component of this story that I think is really, really, really well done over the course of the tale, on top of feeling genuinely like you're being told this tale from this epic. I thought it was really well done. And then The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. So we're looking at another cozy fantasy book. This one I thought was just darling. A lot of what I was saying about Legends and Lattes, this feeling of it doesn't have to be high stakes, world ending in order to care, I really felt like that for The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I think it's darling. I think it's adorable. It's one of those, it just genuinely puts you in a better mood because it's just so precious. And then last for today, looking at tier 1, I will admit that I think of the ones in this top tier, this might be, if I were to tier rank individually each tier and move things around, which I'm not going to actually do, but if I were to do that, I think this book maybe would be at the end of the first tier, because a little bit I'm like, does it actually belong in the second? But I did really like it when I picked it up. It was what opened my eyes to how much I could like short fantasy, and that would be Nettle and Bone. It's also my first T. Kingfisher book, so I have no problem admitting that it's one of those, maybe because it was like the first one from this author, and there's that excitement of, oh my gosh, she has such a huge backlist, and I really like this, and now I get to read so many other things that I think I'm gonna like. That kind of, that feeling of, oh, I found something that is going to lead to so much joy moving forward. Have you ever done that? Like when you first start a new series, and you're like, whoa, I really liked this. And then you're just so excited to read more of the series. I definitely feel like this book gave me that feeling for T. Kingfisher's works, and also for shorter fantasy. Because while it's not a novella, it's not much longer than one. It's pretty short. And I just really enjoyed the humor in it. I liked the ragtag group of characters that come together to go on this kind of silly quest. And I, in general, liked how the plot unfolded. It was just so fun. And also, I was really endeared to the characters. It was just great. It was great. I really enjoyed it. As noted, it maybe actually should be in the second tier, but I don't want to overthink it. I'm just going to leave it at the top for today. Do I think it's as high for me as The Trouble with Peace or Empire of Gold? Probably not, but I still quite enjoyed it. And it's not like I expect literally everything in the top tier for me to have the exact same feelings on all of these books, so it's maybe a little bit on the lower end, but whatever, you get it. The last thing for today is to mention a charity, as I noted before, and specifically a charity that I feel like has in some ways pieces of the kind of person my dad was within it. So for today, we're looking at the World Wildlife Fund, because one of my favorite memories as a kid with my dad was watching nature documentaries, and just in general, just thinking animals were really cool and wanting to go for hikes or drive around parts of Arizona that I'd never seen before. My dad grew up here, and a lot of people didn't live in Arizona when my dad was growing up, because he was born in 46. And Arizona looked very different back then. So just in general, being shown a lot of wildlife and everything, I always really appreciated it, because it was not only a shared experience with my dad, but because wildlife is wonderful. Luna's like, hey, what about me though? She's whining at me. She wants her food. So I definitely feel like this really captures something that my dad loved and also that he kind of instilled in me, which is a love for animals and the environment. And what World Wildlife Fund does is they help with conservation efforts. So if you're interested in checking out this charity, I'll have it linked. The previous two that were mentioned in the first two videos were Doctors Without Borders as well as the Phoenix Children's Hospital. So I'll have all three of these charities linked down below. Thanks so much for watching, though. Feel free to chime in with any of your thoughts about anything that was discussed today. And I am looking forward to doing part 4 and part 5 within the next few months. Also, if you're interested in actually participating in the poll, I'll go ahead and have those on my community tab, so be on the lookout over there. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.